The wind howled through the snowy land, blowing the snow into big, swirling clouds of white. It was hard to see anything because of the heavy snowfall. In the middle of this cold, snowy wilderness, there was a tiny village named Silver Creek. It was surrounded by tall mountains, making it feel hidden from the rest of the world. Silver Creek was a quiet place where people lived simple lives. Winters were very, very cold and people had to work hard to survive. They didn't have much. Electricity would stop working sometimes and the roads would get blocked with snow. The closest hospital was far away, more than 50 miles from the village. In this little village lived a girl named Evelyn Carter, but everyone called her Elara. She was 19 years old and had never left Silver Creek. She was strong, smart, and kind. Life had not been easy for her, but she never gave up. Elara's family was poor. After her father passed away 3 years ago, she had to take care of her sick mother and her little brother, Finn. They lived in a small wooden cabin at the edge of the village. Their house was cold because they didn't have enough firewood, but Elara never complained. She knew how to hunt, fish, and find her way through the snowy mountains. But on one stormy night, something happened that would change Elara's life forever. That night, a stranger appeared in the snow. He was lost in the blizzard, fighting to stay alive. The snowstorm came fast, covering everything in white. Even the people who lived in Silver Creek all their lives wouldn't dare to go outside in such a storm. But Keanu Reeves, a man from far away, was out there, struggling to survive. Keanu had come to Silver Creek for a quiet trip, hoping to escape the noisy, busy city life. He was famous and everywhere he went people recognized him. He wanted to be alone for a while, away from cameras and flashing lights. But things went terribly wrong. While driving on the icy mountain roads, his car slid off the road and crashed into a ditch. His car was stuck and he had no way to call for help. The cold wind bit at his face, his fingers felt frozen and his feet were numb. He knew he had to find shelter fast. Keanu tried to walk through the thick snow, but it was too hard. His legs felt heavy, his eyes started to close, and his body was giving up. Then, just before he lost consciousness, he saw something, a small wooden cabin in the distance. But before he could take another step, he collapsed face first into the snow. Elara was outside her cabin, collecting firewood, when she noticed something strange in the snow. Something dark and unmoving. Her heart started beating fast. She dropped the firewood and ran toward the shape, her boots crunching in the snow. As she got closer, she saw that it was a man lying still in the snow. His lips were turning blue. He wasn't moving. Elara knelt beside him and checked for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. "Hey, can you hear me?" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. No response. His skin was ice cold. If she didn't act fast, he would die. With all her strength, she grabbed him under the arms and started dragging him toward her cabin. He was much bigger and heavier than she was, but she refused to leave him out in the cold. The storm roared around her, but she kept going. Finally, she pulled him inside. Inside the tiny wooden cabin, Elara hurried to light a fire. Her hands worked quickly as she stacked the firewood and struck a match. The flames roared to life, spreading warmth through the room. She turned back to the man. He was still unconscious. Elara removed his wet jacket and boots, trying to warm him up. "Come on," she whispered, rubbing his hands. "Wake up." For hours she worked to keep him alive. She wrapped him in warm blankets and gave him tiny sips of water. Finally, as the sun rose, she heard a soft groan. She turned quickly, eyes wide. The stranger's eyelids fluttered open. Keanu felt like he had just woken up from a dream. His whole body ached and his throat was dry. But more than anything, he felt warm, something he had thought he might never feel again. He blinked, adjusting to the dim light of the cabin. Then he saw her. A girl sitting by the fireplace, watching him with concern. "Where am I?" he croaked. Elara let out a breath of relief. She sat up straighter. "You're safe," she told him. "I found you outside. You were almost frozen to death." Keanu tried to sit up, but pain shot through his body. "Don't move," Elara warned, stopping him. "You were out there for hours. You need to rest." He looked at her carefully. Her clothes were simple and worn. Her hands were rough and chapped from the cold. But her eyes, though tired, were kind. "You saved me?" he asked. Elara nodded. "Yeah. Lucky for you, I was outside when you collapsed." Keanu let out a weak chuckle. Lucky doesn't even begin to cover it. As Keanu rested, Elara cooked a hot meal. The smell of stew filled the small cabin. "You should eat," she said, handing him a bowl. He took it, feeling the warmth spread through his fingers. "You don't even know who I am," he said after a moment. Elara shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You needed help." Keanu looked at her in surprise. For the first time in his life, someone didn't recognize him. She wasn't asking for pictures or acting excited. She was just treating him like a normal person. He smiled slightly. "You don't recognize me?" he asked. Elara raised an eyebrow. "Should I?" Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. For the first time in a long time he felt normal. "No," he said. "Maybe it's better this way." Elara smirked. "So what do I call you then?" Keanu thought for a moment. He could have told her the truth, but he liked the idea of just being a regular guy. "Just call me KC, he said finally. Elara nodded. "All right, KC. But don't think that means you're off the hook. You have some explaining to do when you're feeling better." Keanu laughed and took another spoonful of stew. For the first time in years he felt safe. And he had no idea that the girl who had saved him would soon change his life forever. The cabin creaked as the wind outside howled through the valley. The shutters rattled against the storm, but inside it was warm. KC, once Keanu Reeves but now just KC to Elara, sat near the fire wrapped in thick blankets. His hands held a warm bowl of stew. His body still ached, but he could feel his strength slowly returning. The small cabin was cozy. The furniture was old but strong, the wooden shelves lined with jars of food and books. It was clear that Elara knew how to live with very little but made the most of what she had. "You're lucky to be alive," Elara said, watching him. KC looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Yeah," he admitted. "I owe you my life." Elara shrugged. "You just collapsed in the right place." KC let out a small laugh. "Then I guess I'm even luckier than I thought." And in that moment he realized something. Maybe this tiny, forgotten village was exactly where he was meant to be. For many days Ken stayed inside the cabin, getting his strength back little by little. Elara took care of him in the best way she knew how. She didn't treat him like he was weak and she didn't spoil him. But she made sure he had food, water, and warmth. As the days passed, Ken learned more about the girl who had saved his life. Elara grew up in a small village called Silver Creek. It was so tiny that most maps didn't even show it. She had never left the mountains, never seen a big city, and never been on an airplane. Her whole world was made of snow, survival, and the little village she called home. 3 years ago, Elara's father passed away. After that, it was her job to take care of her mother and younger brother, Finn. They didn't have much, but they made do with what they had. Elara was strong, independent, and always protected her family. Even though life was hard, she never stopped being kind. One night, as Ken sat by the fire, he watched Elara sewing a hole in her brother's coat. Her fingers moved quickly and skillfully with the needle and thread. "You take care of everyone here," Ken said. "But who takes care of you?" Elara didn't look up. "I don't have time to think about that," she said. "I do what I have to do." Ken nodded. He had met many people in his life, but very few were as strong and determined as Elara. When Ken was strong enough, he finally stepped outside for the first time since the storm. Silver Creek was a small, quiet village hidden away from the rest of the world. The people who lived there were tough. They had survived long, cold winters and hard times. But even though life was difficult, they stuck together and helped one another. It didn't take Ken long to realize something. This village was struggling. The houses were old and weak, some barely strong enough to hold up against the heavy snow. The general store had almost no food left, just a few bags of flour and some dried beans. The school had no heat, so the children had to wear thick blankets while they learned. The clinic only had one doctor, and he was very old. He didn't have enough medicine or supplies to help everyone. Ken had spent his whole life around rich and famous people. He had seen expensive cars, huge houses, and fancy parties. But these people, who had almost nothing, were richer in a different way. They were kind. They had each other. Still, Ken knew they deserved more. He wasn't going to just watch them suffer. One evening, Elara sat by the fire, sharpening a knife. Ken cleared his throat and spoke. "I've been thinking," he said. Elara looked up. "About what?" "About what happens when I leave," he said carefully. "I want to help this village. I want to help you." Elara frowned. "We don't need charity," she said firmly. Ken shook his head. "It's not charity. It's a way to thank you. You saved my life, and I don't take that lightly." Elara stared at him for a long time, trying to see if he really meant it. Finally she sighed. "If you really want to help," she said, "there's plenty of work to do." Ken smiled. "Then let's get to work." What Elara didn't know, what no one in the village knew, was that Ken wasn't just offering to help a little. He had a plan that would change Silver Creek forever. The winter wind howled through Silver Creek. The small wooden houses shook under the weight of the snow. The whole village was covered in a thick, white blanket. It was cold, quiet, and struggling. Ken, still known as Casey to Alara and the villagers, walked through the snowy streets, looking at everything around him. He saw children wearing oversized, patched-up coats. Their boots had holes and their little feet shivered in the cold. The general store had almost no food left. The schoolhouse had broken windows, letting in the icy wind. The single furnace barely gave off enough heat for the children to study. The tiny village clinic was falling apart. The old doctor had too many patients and not enough medicine. Ken had seen poor places before, but never like this. The people of Silver Creek never complained. They never asked for help. They just kept going as if this was the only way life could be. But Ken knew things didn't have to be this way. He was going to change everything. Over the next few weeks, Ken became part of Silver Creek. He worked alongside Alara and the villagers. He helped split firewood, carried supplies, and learned to hunt in the freezing cold. He fixed broken roofs, repaired sleds, and even helped in the schoolhouse, sitting with the children as they learned to read and count. People started to trust him. He was no longer an outsider. But no one, not even Alara, knew the truth. No one knew that the man fixing their houses was actually one of the most famous actors in the world. And that was exactly how Ken wanted it. Even though Alara was usually very careful about trusting people, she found herself opening up to Ken. He wasn't like other outsiders. He didn't look down on their way of life. He respected it. One night, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, Alara glanced at him. "You don't belong here," she said suddenly. Ken raised an eyebrow. "What makes you say that?" "You're different," she said. "The way you move, the way you talk. You didn't grow up in a place like this." Ken smiled. He was impressed by how sharp she was. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't." "Then why are you here?" she asked. Her voice was softer this time. Ken thought for a moment. He stared into the fire. "Because I needed to see something real again." Alara tilted her head, thinking about his answer. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. Ken looked at her. He saw the strength in her eyes, the way she never gave up, the kindness in her actions. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I did." Alara held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "glad to be of service." Ken chuckled. But he wasn't just here to watch, he was here to help. And it was time to put his plan into action. Late that night, when the village was asleep, Ken walked to the edge of the mountains. He pulled out his satellite phone and dialed a number. "Hello," a sleepy voice answered. Ken smiled. "Hey Jordan. I need you to do something for me." Jordan Carter, his personal assistant and close friend, was silent for a moment. "Ken, where the heck have you been? You just disappeared." Ken chuckled. "I've been taking a break." "A break? From civilization?" "Something like that," Ken said. "Listen, I don't have much time. I need you to send a team to a village called Silver Creek. They need supplies. Food, medicine, warm clothes, building materials." Quietly, Jordan paused. "Ken, what is this place?" Ken took a deep breath. "It's the place where a girl saved my life. And now, I'm going to return the favor." 3 days later, the trucks arrived. The villagers stood frozen, staring in shock as the vehicles rolled into town. The trucks were packed with supplies. There was food, fresh fruit, vegetables, grains, and canned goods. There were thick winter coats, warm boots, and gloves. There were medical supplies, medicine, bandages, and tools for the clinic. There were even materials to fix homes, wood, nails, and tools. Alara turned to Ken, her eyes full of suspicion. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about this, would you?" Ken gave her his most innocent smile. "Me? I'm just a simple woodcutter." Alara narrowed her eyes. But before she could say anything else, the children ran forward, cheering. For the first time in years, hope had come to Silver Creek. That night, the village was full of joy. People were laughing, singing, and dancing. Alara pulled Keanu to the side, looking at him with serious eyes. "Who are you?" she asked softly but firmly. Keanu held her gaze. He knew he couldn't hide the truth forever. He sighed. "I think it's time I tell you the truth." Alara crossed her arms, waiting. "I'm K. Reeves," he said. She blinked. "I'm supposed to know what that means." Keanu chuckled. "Most people do." Alara tilted her head. She was still confused. "You're famous?" she asked. Keanu laughed. "Yeah, something like that." Alara looked at him, then at the trucks filled with food, coats, and supplies for the village. Suddenly, everything made sense. You paid for all of this?" she whispered. Keanu nodded. "You saved my life," he said. "The least I could do was save yours." Alara looked away for a moment, trying to take it all in. Then she looked back at him. She didn't feel shocked or amazed. Instead, she felt something deeper, respect. And maybe, just maybe, something more. Ilara stood in silence, watching the man in front of her. Keanu Reeves. Kissy. The man she had pulled from the snow, half frozen and weak, had just told her who he really was. She had heard his name before, maybe in an old newspaper or from a traveler passing through their little village, Silver Creek. But she had never cared about famous people. They lived in a different world, far away from hers. Yet here he was, sitting in her small cabin, wearing the same rough clothes as the villagers. He split firewood, hunted with her brother, and sat by the fire like he belonged there. And now she realized he wasn't just an ordinary man. She looked again at the trucks filled with supplies, the warm coats, the food, the medicine. "You did all this?" she asked quietly. Keanu nodded. "I made a few calls." "A few calls?" Ilara laughed a little, shaking her head. "Keanu, this is enough to help the village for years." He shrugged. "I told you, you saved my life. I wanted to do something for you too." Ilara studied him, searching his face for any sign of pity or guilt. But there was none. Just kindness. Just honesty. That, more than anything, made her trust him. The days that followed were the best the village had seen in years. The general store, once empty, was now filled with food and supplies. The schoolhouse, which had been freezing cold in winter, now had heaters. The little clinic, where the doctor had struggled to help people, now had new medicine and equipment. Homes were repaired. Families smiled more. People laughed again. They didn't know where it had all come from, but they didn't ask. They were just grateful. And in the middle of it all, Ilara and Keanu stood side by side, watching Silver Creek come back to life. The more time Ilara spent with Keanu, the more she realized something surprising. Yes, he was rich. Yes, he came from a world far away from hers. But deep down he was just a man. A man who laughed at her little brother Finn's silly jokes. A man who carried heavy sacks of flour for the village elders without being asked. A man who sat by the fire, listening to Ilara talk about her childhood, her father, and the life she had built in the mountains. He didn't talk much about his past. But Ilara could tell he was running from something. One evening, as they sat outside, watching the snow fall under the moonlight, she asked, "Why do I feel like you needed this just as much as we did?" Keanu looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he smiled. "Because you're right," he admitted. "I came here to escape, to find something real again. And you reminded me what that feels like." Ilara held his gaze. Her heart beat a little faster. She had spent so many years alone, carrying the weight of the village on her shoulders. But now, sitting beside this man, the stranger she had saved, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something warm. Something real. One afternoon, as Ilara helped distribute supplies, she found a letter in her coat pocket. Frowning, she opened it. It was from Keanu. "Ilara, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. There's something I need to take care of before I can figure out what I want next. But before I go, I need you to know something. You didn't just save my life in that storm. You reminded me what it means to live. You showed me a world where people don't care about money or fame. You showed me what it means to fight for something real. I don't know where my path leads next. But I do know this, I owe you more than I can ever repay. This village is safe now. And it's because of you. Take care of yourself. And if you ever need me, you know where to find me. Kissy." Ilara's fingers tightened around the paper. Gone. Just like that. She looked up at the horizon. But there was no sign of him. Keanu Reeves, the man she had saved, the man who had changed everything, was gone. And for the first time in years, Ilara felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Loss. Seasons passed. Silver Creek continued to grow and thrive, thanks to the mysterious donations and supplies from months ago. Ilara kept busy. She hunted, took care of her little brother and mother, and worked in the village. But no matter how much time passed, she never forgot him. And then, on the first snowfall of winter, he came back. At the edge of the village, a tall figure stood in the snow. Dressed in a thick black coat, his dark hair dusted with flakes, his eyes filled with something unspoken. Ilara froze, her breath catching. Keanu Reeves. He had come back. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The villagers whispered, staring. "Is that?" "No way. He's back." Ilara clenched her fists. Her emotions swirled between shock, relief, and anger. He had left her. Just a letter, no other word. And now, after a whole year, he was standing in front of her like no time had passed. She wasn't sure if she wanted to punch him or run to him. Keanu took a step forward. "Hey, Ilara." Her jaw tightened. That's all you have to say? He sighed. His breath was heavy in the cold air. Can we talk? She studied him for a long moment. Then she turned abruptly. Fine. But not here. She walked toward her cabin. He followed. Once inside, the door shut behind them. Alara spun around. Where the hell have you been? She demanded. You left, Keanu. No warning. Just a letter. A letter. Keanu ran a hand through his hair, his face full of regret. I know. And I'm sorry. Sorry? She scoffed. You think that's enough? I had to go, he said quietly. I had to figure out if I could walk away from my old life completely. And did you? She whispered. He stepped closer. His voice was soft, certain. I did. Alara's heart pounded. I don't understand. He smiled a little. I spent the last year rebuilding my life. But this time I built it knowing I wanted to come back. Her breath caught. I couldn't stop thinking about you, he admitted. Alara swallowed hard. She didn't want to believe him. You left me, Keanu, she whispered. He stepped even closer. I know, he said. And I hate myself for it. Silence. The fire crackled between them. And Alara realized, maybe, just maybe, he had come back for her. Then Keanu finally spoke again. I'm here now, he said softly. And this time I'm not leaving. Silver Creek still needed him. The days that followed felt like a dream. Keanu wasn't just back, he was back for good. He helped rebuild the school so the children of Silver Creek would have a place to learn. He used his money to build a new medical center so that no one in the village would have to suffer through the cold winter without a doctor or medicine. He made sure the village had enough food and warmth, investing in better farming and energy. Most of all, he stayed. But things between him and Alara were not the same. For a whole year, Alara had taught herself not to miss him. She had told herself over and over that she didn't need him anymore. But now here he was, working beside her, smiling at her, talking to her as if he had never left. And Alara didn't know how to feel about that. One evening, after a long day of fixing houses, Alara sat outside watching the snowfall. She thought she was alone. But then she heard footsteps. Keanu walked up beside her, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. Can't sleep? He asked, handing her a cup. Alara hesitated, then took it. Something like that. They sat together in silence, watching the snowflakes float down from the dark sky. Then Keanu finally spoke. I know you don't trust me anymore, he said in a quiet voice. And I don't blame you. Alara didn't say anything. But I meant what I said, Keanu continued. I'm not leaving again. She turned to him, her eyes filled with both anger and sadness. And what happens when you get bored? She asked. What happens when this place or I am not enough for you? Keanu set his cup down and looked straight into her eyes. I won't, he said. Alara swallowed hard. How do you know? Keanu took a deep breath. Because you're the only person who ever saw me for who I really am, he admitted. And I'd be a fool to ever walk away from that again. His words hit her heart like a wave. She wanted to fight it. She wanted to push him away. But instead, she whispered the only thing she could say. Then prove it. Keanu smiled. I will. And for the first time in a long time, Alara let herself believe him. Winter in Silver Creek was always cold, always tough. But this winter felt different. The snow still covered the ground. The cold still bit at their skin. But something had changed. Something warmer. Something stronger. Keanu was back. But this time he wasn't just passing through. He stayed. Every day he worked hard. He helped rebuild homes so no one in Silver Creek would be cold again. He made the new medical center bigger, bringing in doctors and supplies. He funded the new school, making sure the children could dream bigger than ever before. He worked beside Alara, never asking for special treatment, never acting like he was better than the others. And little by little, Alara's heart began to change. For a whole year, Alara had told herself that she didn't need Keanu. But now she sees him every day. She watched him laugh with Finn. She watched him fix her mother's roof. She watched him chop firewood without complaining. And she realized something she didn't want to admit. She had missed him more than anything. At first she tried to fight it. She tried to keep her guard up. But Keanu never pushed her. He never demanded anything. He just stayed. And little by little she let him back in. One night, after a long day, Alara walked up a path to the cliff that overlooked the valley. It was her favorite place. When she was a little girl, her father had brought her here and taught her how to listen to the wind and read the stars. She wasn't surprised when she heard footsteps behind her. Keanu, she said, turning around. You keep following me. Keanu smirked, putting his hands in his coat pockets. You keep running off to interesting places." They stood together looking over the valley. The moonlight made the snow sparkle like silver. After a while, Keanu spoke. "Elara," he said. His voice was soft but serious. "I need to ask you something." She turned to him. Her breath was visible in the cold air. "What is it?" Keanu hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden carving. It was a tiny wolf. Hand-carved. Simple. Beautiful. Elara took it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth edges. "I made it for you," Keanu said softly. "You remind me of a wolf. Strong. Independent. Always protecting your pack." Elara swallowed hard. She had spent her whole life being strong for others. She had carried so much responsibility alone. But now, here was this man offering to stand beside her. "Keanu," she whispered. Her walls broke completely. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I don't want to leave again," he said. "But I don't just want to stay as an outsider. I want to be part of this. Part of you. If you'll have me." Elara looked up at him. Really looked at him. The man who had once been a stranger in the snow. The man who had changed everything. The man she had once feared she had lost forever. And then, finally, she let herself believe. She took a deep breath, then closed the distance between them. She stood on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was home. When they pulled apart, Keanu smiled down at her. "Does this mean you'll keep me around?" he teased. Elara laughed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I suppose I could use an extra pair of hands around here." He chuckled and kissed her forehead. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." The days that followed felt like a dream. Keanu officially became a part of the village. He worked with the people, not as a rich man but as a friend. He and Elara built something real. Not just a home but a life together. For the first time in years, Elara shared the burden she had carried alone. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Finn. She had her mother. She had Silver Creek. And now she has Keanu. On the first night of spring, as the last of the snow melted, Elara and Keanu sat outside. They watched the stars. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Elara asked, her fingers entwined with his. Keanu thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. "No," he said. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." Elara smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Because no matter what came next, she knew one thing for sure. She and Keanu had found each other in the snow. And nothing would ever change that. If you like this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures, mysteries, and unforgettable moments. Your support keeps these stories alive and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching. I can't wait to see you in the next video.